This is the IDP After Show.
Hey everyone, a huge welcome to the IDP After Show Rankings episode. I'm Jase Abbey and I'm going to be breaking down some of the juiciest players in my Week 7 rankings. Usually at this point, I'll introduce an amazing guest whose rankings we compare with my own. But tonight, for one episode only, you guys are lucky enough to just have me. Now, don't worry, it's still going to be packed with all the info you need to navigate Week 7 of the fantasy calendar. And it's not an easy week, right? We've got 6 teams on a bye, meaning we're scrambling around trying to find players that we can start. But hopefully, that's where I can come in. I'm going to highlight some of the best and worst players at each defensive position based on form, matchup, opportunity, and more. And this will involve a handful of deep dives on some featured players, as well as the new quickfire segment where I give you a short list of a bunch of guys who I either like or don't like for the week. So there should be something for everybody, regardless of how deep your league is. But yeah, enough with the preamble. Let's kick things off by talking about linebackers. Now, first up is a guy who has risen, or rather sort of reinstated his place in my rankings for Week 7, and it's Micah McFadden. He's my LB 41, one behind JOK and one ahead of Nakobe Dean. So look, many of us kind of wondered if he'd reestablish himself in the lineup after a one-game absence due to injury. Famously, in his place, the Giants turned to Isaiah Simmons, who put up 10 tackles against the Dolphins. It was a team-leading 10 tackles, tying Bobby O. But McFadden not only won his job back last weekend against Buffalo, relegating Simmons to his smallest snap share of the season, but McFadden also saw a season-high 79% snap share himself. And the results were great. He had 9 combined tackles, an interception, a QB hit, and 2 QB hurries. Now, it's going to be a challenge, we know this, to come close to replicating those numbers while he's missing, 25% of his team's defensive plays each week. And that's why he's listed below some of those other guys who do have larger roles for their teams. But I feel like, he's a pretty safe bet to fire up as an LB4 in a week, like I've said, where you've got 6 teams missing. The number of options out there have been depleted. Even against, I think, a Commanders team who he's playing this week, who typically don't give up a lot of tackles to linebackers. So, yeah. And so to the quickfire list of other linebackers who I've shown a bit of love to in my rankings for Week 7. And it starts with Dorian Williams, who appears to have easily beaten Tyrell Dodson in the race to help replace Matt Milano. So Williams had an 84% snap share to only 5% for Dodson. And Williams finished with 9 combined tackles. It just looks like his job to lose. Next up, Devin Lloyd. His poor form earlier in the year and his 2-game absence when the Jaguars came to London made us kind of wonder whether Muma would eat into his role, right? But the answer was a clear nope. Lloyd played all but 2 defensive downs last week. Next up, Patrick Queen. The sack volume might be more difficult to achieve against a tough Detroit Lions offensive line, but they do tend to allow a solid volume of tackles to opposition linebackers. Nakobe Dean. They're clearly easing him in. His role isn't yet big enough to make me trust starting him as anything more than an LB4. But I'd be surprised if we didn't see his role grow steadily over the next few weeks. Looking at around 60-75% if I was forced to put a number on it within the next 2 weeks. And maybe, last but not least, Oren Burks if Greenlaw can't get healthy in time. So, yeah, those are the linebackers I like. The guys I don't like. So my first featured guy at the position, linebacker who I don't like, is Nicholas Morrow. He's my LB 49. One behind Jelani Tavai and one ahead of Christian Rosaboom. So why? It's simple. Nakobe Dean is back. We knew it would affect either Cunningham or Morrow, and I'm pleased to say that John Macri and myself correctly guessed on his Week 6 preview pod that it would be Morrow who was going to be the guy who would be hit the hardest. Now, the snap share split that we saw had Cunningham with 75%, Morrow in second with 55%, and Dean following up in third with 49%. But as I said earlier on, we've got to imagine Dean's role is going to continue to grow, and it looks like Morrow's going to be the guy that misses out. He had a couple of bright spots with that 3-sack game, but yeah, his involvement and soon his production will come to a skidding halt. So yeah, fading Morrow. Quick list of other linebackers I'm fading this week includes guys like Drue Tranquil. He was the biggest loser following Nick Bolton's return to the Chiefs lineup, a 37% snap share. That's not helping anyone. Jerome Baker and David Long. So we've kind of flip-flopped at times between these two guys as the season's been wearing on, when the Dolphins don't seem to realize who it is that they prefer. But last week was the first week we saw Jalen Phillips coming back, Van Ginkel playing a few more snaps in that sort of off-ball linebacker role. And sadly, it's affected both Baker and Long. I don't know if either of them are guys that we can trust on a weekly basis going forward, unless maybe in a week like this, we've got a lot of guys on a bye. And I'm keeping a close eye on guys like Eric Kendricks and Josey Jewell. Neither guy has really returned to that sort of every down role that I expected them to after they recovered from injury. And that, as I've said before, they can still be productive. Both guys were kind of reasonably productive last week, but over time, when you're missing 15, 20, 25% of your team's snaps, it adds up. So yeah, their seasonal finishes might be not what I expected them to be if they don't start to assume those every down roles. So taking back those roles from Kenneth Murray and Alex Singleton. Let's see what happens. So defensive line. The defensive lineman I want to highlight for positive reasons this week is Jonathan Allen, first and foremost. So he's my DT3 or my DL16. That's one behind Josh Sweat and one ahead of Kayvon Thibodeaux. So he's the guy on the defensive line I want to talk about for the Commanders, but I really could have chosen anyone in their front four. The Giants' offensive line has been so bad through the first 7 games. A lot has been made about the fact that Commanders and Sam Howell have allowed the most sacks in the league, but the Giants are right up there with them, surrendering 32 sacks, only 2 behind the Commanders, despite having fewer dropbacks between Daniel Jones and Tyrod Taylor. A lot of the blame for the Giants' issues has been directed at their offensive tackles. Andrew Thomas, who's clearly their best player on that offensive line, he's missed the last 5 games with a hamstring injury. He's been sorely missed, in fact. But the interior is also poor. You got guys like Mark Lewinsky and Ben Bredeson. They're just horribly inconsistent. So, yeah, if that wasn't bad enough, they've also got a few injuries they're carrying into the week too. And Daniel Jones doesn't look fully healthy himself. Look, enter Jonathan Allen. Now, Allen hasn't been bad this year, far from it. 3 sacks in 6 games. He's tied 9th amongst all interior defensive linemen with 20 pressures, and he ranks 3rd at the position in combined tackles, so giving you a bit of a weekly floor as well there. But he is a little way off the pace in terms of what we saw him do in the last few years when he finished with 10 and 8 sacks respectively. But I think this is a game where he can really take advantage of that porous Giants offensive line. So to the quick list of the other guys with favorable matchups on the defensive line this week, all of the other Commanders, as I said. So Chase Young, Montez Sweat, maybe Daron Payne. But there's a few guys on the other side as well, right? So we got Kayvon Thibodeaux, possibly Dexter Lawrence, still waiting for that first breakthrough sack, but still playing well. And if you're desperate, Leonard Williams as well. Right? So there's these guys are playing against a poor offensive line too. Who else? Maxx Crosby. I try not to mention the most obvious guys because who's dropping a player like Maxx Crosby, right? But yeah, he's my DR1 and has been for 2 to 3 weeks. He's going up against the Bears, I believe. So yeah, he obviously in incredible form, and he's going to have, he could feast. He should feast this weekend yet again. Rashan Gary is a guy I'm interested in seeing what he can do. He just needs a healthier snap share. I mean, there's easing a guy along, and then there's just dragging it out over the course of half a season, right? Fortunately for Gary's fantasy managers, he's still got it done, despite playing, 20, 30% of the available snaps, which is way below what we want it to be. Thankfully, last week we saw 47%, and we just hope that continues to grow. This weekend, he goes up against the Broncos and Mike McGlinchey. McGlinchey's allowed the 5th most pressures and the 2nd most sacks. So this could be a huge week for Gary. Just need him to start playing a little more. And so to the defensive lineman I'm fading in week 7. The featured guy is a guy that might sound like a bit of an odd nomination. So I've gone with AJ Epenesa. Now he's my edge 26 or DL 33, one behind Nick Benito and one ahead of Jalen Phillips. And like I say, it might seem like an odd nomination because he's playing some of his best football. 4 sacks in the last 5 games, PFF rush grades that are off the charts in his last 2. But I like to look a little bit deeper than that. And here's what I see. A guy who is usually mired in a deep rotation, but who has been playing without guys like Greg Rousseau, Shaq Lawson, and Von Miller at times. And last week, with all 5 of those guys fully healthy for the first time, Epenesa's snap share dropped from 67% the week before to just 27%. Now, you've got to believe Von Miller's role will continue to grow as he gets healthier. And let's not forget that Epenesa isn't exactly head and shoulders above the rest of the Bills' edge rushers of late, because we've got Leonard Floyd, who's been on a tear, Greg Rousseau, who has 3 sacks in his last 3 games, and I think remains one of the most underrated edge rushers in football. But he's also playing against the Patriots' offensive line, who, yes, they've been poor. The only player on that offensive line who has performed well this year is Tre Brown, the Patriots' left tackle, and Epenesa is one of the few Bills edge rushers who sticks almost exclusively to one side. And unfortunately for him, this week, that's Brown. Now, in a week like this one, where many of our studs are on a bye, I understand that trying to find a DL2 or even a DL3, as good as Epenesa, is going to be a struggle. But if you can find a comparable option, I recommend you do so. So moving on to the quickfire list of other guys with unfavorable matchups. I don't like Christian Wilkins this weekend. That Eagles offensive line, they've completely shut down Aaron Donald and Quinnen Williams in the last 2 weeks, arguably the 2 most talented interior defensive linemen in the league. And they can do the same with Wilkins. And while I'm here, you can include the other Dolphins pass rushers here too. So Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, just don't like their week 7 outlook. Justin Madubuike of the Ravens, he's been running hot lately, hasn't he, with five sacks in 6 games. But Frank Ragnow and co are one of the main reasons that Lions offense is doing what it's been doing. And lastly, DeForest Buckner, he's going up against the Browns. That Browns offensive line has its weaknesses, but it's on the edges. They're stronger in the interior. So don't really like Buckner's matchup this week. So onto the defensive backs. So my DB riser for the week is a guy that's not really been getting it done the last few weeks, and it's Jevon Holland. He's my DB and safety 9, one behind Josh Metellus and one ahead of Julian Blackmon. So as I say, he's had a quiet 2 games after starting off the season red hot. But the Dolphins versus the Eagles is probably going to be a shootout. And Johnny the Greek talked about this in the Cornerback Corner article. The Dolphins defense may be on the field for sustained drives. It also helps Holland that the Eagles allow one of the highest tackle efficiencies to opposition safeties. So even if Holland doesn't produce the big plays that we so sorely want, there is optimism he can at least provide a safer weekly floor than that which we've seen from him in the last few weeks. So let's do a quick rundown of other safeties we like this weekend. We've got Jabrill Peppers. He's on my radar because, he's been a bit hit and miss. He all but disappeared 2 weeks ago, I think it was, when he had something like 2 tackles. But he did rebound last week with 8 tackles and a pass breakup. And I find it kind of interesting that he's been keeping pace with, and on occasion exceeding, the snap share of Kyle Duggar, who everyone loves. So that's something to keep an eye on. Devon Witherspoon, he's another guy. He continues to light it up, not only in terms of his production, but also in terms of how well he's actually playing, especially when they've moved into the slot, predominantly into the slot for the last 2 games. So he's a corner that's risen on my board. He might be on my CB1 this week, I forget. And Jamal Adams, we saw him make a very brief but impactful debut the other side of the Seahawks bye before playing 85% of the defensive snaps last weekend. I mean, the results weren't great. 4 tackles and a QB hit. Wasn't anything to get too excited about, but I think better days are ahead. And like I say, I like that snap share. 85% is pretty healthy. My DB fallers then. So Julian Love, safety 43, DB 57, 1 behind Kirby Joseph, 1 ahead of Pat Surtain. I mean, what happened? The guy's role was seemingly affected by the last player I mentioned. So Jamal Adams, he fell behind both Adams and Diggs in the pecking order on the day, not even playing half of the available defensive snaps. I would have removed him from my rankings altogether, but I need to be convinced that the knock he got early in the game wasn't a factor. When healthy, Love has been serviceable with 38 combined tackles and 3 pass breakups. But unless we see a sharp rise in his involvement this week, his future just doesn't look bright. Now, joining him on my list of DBs I'm fading for week 7 are Marcus Williams, who John Harbaugh said is iffy to play against Detroit, bit of an obvious one there. Myles Bryant, who appears to be losing some playing time to J.C. Jackson, who the Pats acquired or reacquired from the Chargers a few weeks back. And there's Tre Brown of the Seahawks. Now, he's been lighting it up when he plays, and he deserves to be more involved. But he's behind Witherspoon. He's got Tariq Woolen there too. And he's been playing at or below 3/4 of the available snaps in 3 of the 4 games he's played. And that makes me worry that he might drop off. So sell high even on a Tre Brown type if you can. So that's us done. It's usually at this point I would thank my guest for their insight and analysis, but as it's just me, I'll instead thank the audience for indulging in nothing but me on today's show. I'm going to make it up to you all next week by having the amazing John Macri of PFF on as my guest on the show, so please tune in for that. In the meantime, you can find me on X at Jase Abbey. And as usual, my weekly rankings, which includes 200 guys across 5 different IDP positions, is available at theidpshow.com. But for now, and until next time, thanks and bye.
This was the IDP After Show.